Consciousness is a simulated state. It can only exist in dreams, not in physics. What do we mean by consciousness? The confusion that we have with consciousness is that we think it must be a physical thing because it's really existing. But to really exist, things don't need to be physically implemented. For instance, money is not physical, right? Yet you cannot explain our reality if you assume that money doesn't exist. It is implemented in reality. It's implemented using little sheets of paper that we print numbers on in bank accounts, in computers, and so on and so on. And we use it to structure reality. It has causal power. Money is a pattern with causal power that exists because we project it in a stable way into the world, right? And money exists as if it was real. It's virtual in a way, but it's implemented in such a way that it works. And our mental states are in the same category. They are virtual. They exist as if. If you zoom in and you see the matter interacting, you see just these patterns in the activation between neurons. Neurons are not conscious. They're physical mechanisms, right? Brains are not conscious. But for a brain, it would be very useful to know what it would be like if there was a person that cared and perceived everything as it happens. And so they create a simulation of this that exists virtually as if a dream. And we exist in that dream. Consciousness is a simulated state. It can only exist in dreams, not in physics. And this is basically this big conundrum that we experience. We notice that we exist in a dream. Right? It's a big conspiracy. Magic is possible. And yet the physicists tell us that it's not. But physics is talking about a parent universe that is made out of arcane mathematics, quantum mechanics, and so on. We can never visit this parent universe because in physics you cannot be conscious. You can only be conscious in a dream. And physics has the property of creating brains and organisms that can dream. Our perception of reality is a trance in a dream. We can deconstruct it if we wake up. We realize it's just a representation. So, but can we compare our digital computers at all to human brains? Of course, these systems are designed in a very, very different way. We have an outside-in design in computers, so it's behaving in a very well-fashioned way. We know what it's going to do in every moment. And the training is decoupled. We give it static data. It's not interacting with the world while it's training. It is based on a prediction paradigm, and it uses machine learning training algorithms. And our mind is very different. Our brains are using an inside-out design. It's self-organizing. It's coupled with the environment in real time. It's optimizing for coherence. If you look at the individual neuron, these are mouse neurons, embryonal ones, you see they are all single-cell animals that try to survive, each of them self-directed. And they have to link up and find an organization among each other that works, or otherwise they will starve to death. And this is how it works. So there was a branch in computer science that looked at these principles of self-organization and looked, can we use them to understand computation and self-organizing systems? Then came this idea of cellular automata by Conway and others, where we build computation in a systematic way out of simple systems that only look at the state of their neighbors, of their environment, and then change state accordingly to what they observe in their environment. And the biologist Mike Levin is working with extending this into neural cellular automata that explain development in organism, but also possibly the self-organization of our brain. Neuroscientist Jerry Edelman suggests that our genome is not encoding a very specific architecture for our brain. Instead, in everybody's mind, there is an evolution going on, an evolutionary competition between different forms of governance. And there is only enough information in the genome to bias that competition so it converges relatively quickly into the right architecture. So every mind is an evolving system. Everyone has an individual evolution in our mind for structure. And I suspect that consciousness is very, very instrumental there because it's this main principle of the organization. We typically think that consciousness is extremely sophisticated, maybe only we have it, it's super rare in nature, it's really the pinnacle of things, but you don't get conscious after the PhD, right? You become conscious before you can track a finger. So you also notice if somebody is not getting conscious as an infant, they're not getting anywhere, they remain a vegetable. And while we are not conscious, we cannot actually learn. Right? So it seems to be simple learning algorithm in nature for a self-organizing system. That's a hypothesis. I don't know whether that's true. But I think it's very tempting to think like this. That consciousness comes first, not last in mental organization. So maybe it's more simple than perception and thinking and everything else, and all the other stuff comes from the organization that consciousness imposes on it. It's much more ubiquitous in nature than we think. And maybe we are not the first ones to discover on this. And I suspect that this theory has always been hidden in plain sight. This text is the first chapter of Genesis. And if you ever read this text, it's very cryptic, much more than the others, right? It describes this Ruach Elohim hovering over the waters before there's anything else, where there's no space, no time, no light, no darkness, but there's already water. And then it builds a firmament that separates the waters above the firmament from below the firmament. And you know how the whole thing ends. It creates us in its own image. I don't like anything like a spirit hovering over the waters, right? What does this mean? also where these people confused, right? It's telling a story about the creation of a physical universe by a supernatural being. What kind of experiments do they claim to have made? Maybe the story actually is a 6-step theory about the emergence of consciousness and cognition in a mind. Because the universe that we are in is a dream, right? We dream this universe that we are in. There are no colors and sounds and emotions and facial expressions in physics. They all exist in our minds as ways to make sense of reality. And the physical universe, back then when this text was written, was not a thing. People haven't discovered this idea of describing the universe with short differential equations. Instead, they realized we are in a dream. And so they observed in themselves and in others and their children how this dream is forming. And so this all starts out with consciousness hovering over the substrate. We now know that the substrate are neurons. They didn't know this, so they just used the word substrate. And the next people didn't know what substrate means, so they translated as water. And so consciousness forms on the substrate, and the substrate is uninitialized into Huwabohu, and then we make a separation, this firmament, between two areas of the substrate. One is the world model, the stuff that we perceive as stuff in space, perception, which Descartes later calls res extensa, and everything else is ideas, thoughts, reflections that are asynchronous to our perception, that happen independently of it. And they're clearly separated, right? Because if you were perceiving your thoughts, you would be hallucinating them and you could not function. So you have a clear separation between the world and the idea sphere. And in this old text, the world is called Earth, and the other one heaven, the sphere of ideas. So the next thing is it figures out to create oscillations in there, and it takes the intensity of the oscillation, associates it with brightness, with the color of the day, and the flatness of this contrast with dark. In this way, it now has a continuous dimension, and by combining dimensions, we can create objects. And the first object it makes is by combining two dimensions, is the plane. And the plane gets associated with the ground, and the baby happily crawls on the ground and makes sense of it in 2D. And at some point, it's able to discover the third dimension, and now it can reason about how to build a tower, for instance, which very small babies cannot really understand. And then it figures out how to make solid objects and liquid and organic shapes and so on, and it understands how lighting changes over time and becomes invariant against changes in lighting. And then it creates all the plants and the animals and gives them all their names. Right, again, this is not physical objects, it's objects in your mind that have names. And then it's also creating a model of the interests of the organism. And it realizes that the purpose of the exercise is to navigate the organism in the world. And then at some point, it identifies as the organism. And we see this in children typically happening between 2.5 and 5 years old, that they talk about themselves in the first person. Before that, they can already talk, and they talk about themselves in the third person. And I don't think that's because I is such a complicated word or because they never hear anybody using it. It is, I think, because they do not identify in the first person before they make this switch. They switch to this different spirit that is created in the image of the original consciousness, but as something that thinks of itself as man, as woman, and woman, something that identifies as a human being. Right? So we are basically created by our consciousness, by our infant baby consciousness in our mind, and then put into this world, in the simulation world that our mind is creating. And then we forget that we created this world in our own mind and identify as this human being that is in this world and is subjected to it. And at some point, we can start meditating, or we take acid, and then wake up from this again and realize, oh my God, I'm actually not that self model. I'm not that self. The self is just a model of a person that doesn't actually exist. It's a story that my mind is telling itself, and I'm actually the universe. I'm everything. And then you wake up a little bit more and you realize, oh no, I'm actually the thing that generates it all. I am the generator of everything that I'm interacting with, or that makes sense to me, right? So what consciousness is basically creating is a very sophisticated natural learning algorithm, a self-perpetuating, intelligent, recurrent information transformer, abbreviated SPIRIT. SPIRIT is basically a self-organizing software agent. Oh my God, we have just rediscovered something. There are software agents in nature. A software agent is a causal pattern that is able to change things, but it's not physical, right? The software in this computer is not physical, but it's causal. It can change things, and it's stable. And if it's in nature, it needs to be self-stabilizing. It needs to entrain itself on the substrate and control the substrate so it can be implemented. And it's a very interesting perspective if we realize that the actual invariance in living things is not the molecules of the cells or the mechanisms or the genes, but the software that is running on them. It's a very interesting perspective. It's basically animism.